Assalamu alaikum. Today we will go over the explanation of Surah Al-Baqarah from verses 6 through 20. I have organized the verses in groups by topic so we can compare and contrast the ideas visually. The topic of these verses are about the disbelievers and the hypocrites. Now let's look at verses 6 and 7 in a pair, which Tafsir Al-Jalalain characterizes to be the distinctive disbelievers like Abu Jahl and Abu Lahab. We see in verse 7 that Allah has set a seal on their faculties because their choice was final with respect to rejecting faith, the messenger, and the Quran. So any amount of warning would not help, as Allah knows the state of the hearts. I talked before in another video on how the Quran is interactive. It responds to what the heart chooses to adopt. So the sealing shows a finality as the heart is sealed from responding with faith or reason, and their vision or hearing will not benefit through reciting or listening to the Quran. Now let's look at verses 8 through 16 on the hypocrites. So hypocrites are difficult to detect since they claim faith and they stay with the believers. So we will observe in all of these verses that the claim of the hypocrites would reflect back on themselves, but with an increased effect as a consequence. So in these verses, observe how Allah always contradicts and negates their position. In verse 8, notice the hypocrite is saying, we believe, but Allah negates with the same term. They are not believers. In verse 9, they are sure they are deceiving, but Quran contradicts with the same words that they are not deceiving while not being aware. Thinking they are deceiving, which makes their condition worse because they thought their duplicity would strengthen their outcome. But this would be harmful for them in this world and in the next. So in verse 10, Allah says their hearts harbor the disease of hypocrisy. And because of their habitual hypocrisy, the interactive response from the Quran is an increase and finality of the disease, which is sealed in the heart. So in verse 11, they claim to be reformers, but Allah negates in verse 12 by saying, unquestionably, they are corrupters, again making the effect worse as they perceive not. In verse 13, they say the Muslims are foolish to believe and to go against the majority of the mushrikeens of the time. But again, Allah contradicts that by saying, unquestionably, they are foolish, while being unaware of their own foolishness, which is worse, as they think they are being wise by not supporting the truth for their own self-interest. So in all of these verses, we see how the claim of the hypocrites reflect back on themselves, but only with a worsened effect. We also observe from these verses that the punishment is equivalent to the crime. So in verse 14, they mock the believers with their hypocrisy, and in reciprocation, Allah mocks them in verse 15, which makes their state final. And they are prolonged in this state of hypocrisy, as Allah gives them time to keep going on in their hypocrisy. So Ibn Kathir explains that the first act is an act of injustice by the hypocrites, while the second act of response from Allah is an act of justice by Allah. In verse 16, we see that the extreme hypocrites have exchanged the potential for guidance in the Quran to purchase misguidance. So the word purchase is suitable because they did all this for some material gain of this world. Now we will look at verse 17 through 20 in a group. Ibn Kathir explains in his tafsir that these verses are speaking about two different types of hypocrite. If we examine verse 17 and 18, we see the first type of hypocrite, while verse 19 and 20 shows the second type of hypocrite. Verse 17 talks about the light from the fire, which refers to the light of truth that came with Islam, the light that distinguishes truth from falsehood. So the first type of hypocrite is very final in their choice of hypocrisy. Verse 17 uses absolute words to denote the punishment, as we see the path is closed out for the hypocrite who will not accept Islam and secretly opposed it. As described, Allah took away their light. And in verse 18, their sense faculties, such as listening, speaking, vision, are sealed, and they will not return. So this type of hypocrite had become Muslims for the sake of self-interest, and they were final with their choice to just deceive Islam. However, the second type of hypocrite are those who suffer from doubt and suspicion, and their faith is shaky. We can see the verses in 19 to 20 describing the hesitant hypocrite whose light of faith is sometimes lit and other times extinguished. So the rainfall here stands for Islam, and the darkness, thunder, and lightning stand for the threats and difficulties the Muslims were facing from the opponents of Islam. In verse 20, these hypocrites in Medina, they walked therein, meaning they went along with Muslims whenever convenient, such as when they thought the prospect existed to acquire a share in the victories of Islam, but they stood still whenever Islam suffered a calamity, showing readiness to leave their faith. So when times are tough, such hypocrites fall into confusion. We can observe words such as in verse 20, the lightning almost snatched their vision, and Allah provided them a warning that He could have taken away their hearing and their sight, but He did not. So we can compare these two verses, as there is still a chance for this kind of hypocrite to rectify himself as compared to the finality that we observed in verse 17 and 18. So if Allah willed, He could have sealed the sense faculties of these hypocrites so they would not be able to return to light. However, Allah wills to give them time and more opportunity to see and hear the truth. Of course, to the extent that the hypocrites had willed it themselves to seek the truth. I have seen a practical example of this type of hypocrite with Muslims a few years back, when Muslims were under a lot of criticism due to the wrongdoing of some Muslims in the name of Islam. During that time, some Muslims started to become shaky in their faith. So when times are tough, such hypocrites fall into confusion. Later, these hypocrite Muslims may have repented and came back to Islam, as Allah did not close out their possibilities to return until they themselves choose to. That concludes this session. Until next time, please like, subscribe, and keep watching this series. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.